She was always the silent powerhouse, the creative force behind the scenes, the woman whose songs inspired generations and whose words oozed sincerity. Carole King was always the talk of the town. Up until now, her music has done the talking, because Carole King is finally naming names today, after decades of silence. There were 6 of them. She can no longer stand 6 musicians. There were 6 individuals who disregarded limits, crossed barriers, or worse, revered the essence of music. This is a reckoning, not gossip. Every name has a backstory, a scar, a betrayal. The first name was unexpected. Before discovering that peace may conceal power, she had a great deal of admiration for this person. That name was Don Henley. It began with awe. Admired Henley's voice, his musical taste, and the Eagles' ability to combine California rock with country music. However, that regard soon soured. They got into a heated argument during a 1979 recording session in Los Angeles. Carole wanted unadulterated passion. Henley desired excellence. He sanded down the soul of every song until it was sterile, she said. She was accused of being overly sensitive by him. It was an ice fallout. In the middle of the session, Carole left. She also never forgave Henley for rejecting her opinion in an interview. She still declines to go to gatherings where he is expected to make an appearance. But she carried more than just emotional scars. Some were the result of plain conceit, wrapped in glitter and glitz. Elton John comes into the narrative at that point. A brief but genuine moment occurred when Carole and Elton nearly worked magic together. Ego got in the way, even though they were both giants, pianists, and storytellers. Elton controlled the room, telling her to spice it up as he did in the UK, changing her chord progressions and interrupting her mid-verse. Carole felt like she was being steamrolled. She left after a bad 1983 rehearsal and never returned. It was like attempting to duet with a cyclone, she later told friends. Some rejections are more painful because of silence rather than volume. It took place at a benefit performance in the teens, just like the one she received from Eric Clapton. Always polite and willing to work with others, Carole King came to Clapton with a straightforward idea, an acoustic representation of a natural woman, unvarnished and heartfelt, her voice held by the warmth of his renowned guitar. There was no power play. It was a respectful gesture and an invitation. Clapton, however, did not hear the music. All he saw was himself. He hardly gave her a glance as he shrugged. He murmured, "Not my thing." The words weren't the issue. The coldness in his voice was the cause. Aim to place my experiences within a broader historical framework. That is really significant to me since, like you, I consider myself to be an observer. We have that, after all. The tone of dismissal, the casual indifference, as though her body of work, legacy and overall musical contribution were all insignificant, as though she wasn't deserving of being on stage with him. That moment resonated in Carole's mind. Not only she had supported titans, influenced a generation's emotional vocabulary, and now she was dismissed like a novice. The smile didn't reach her eyes as she walked out that evening. She felt invisible, with reduced, not because she wanted his praise but because she believed he could appreciate the beauty of space, restraint, and allowing a song to breathe, just as she did. He opted for quiet instead, and that silence was more powerful than any guitar riff. It was a missed opportunity to meet heart to heart, not just a failed performance. And it was something Carole King never forgot. Bob Dylan was the victim of that. When Carole and Bob were scheduled for the same festival in the early 17th century, everyone anticipated magic. People dreamed about this type of union. Generations worth of voices and songwriters share the same backstage atmosphere. But Carole discovered icy indifference in place of a bomb. She came to him as someone who had appreciated his poetry, his tenacity, and his brilliance rather than as an equal. She was appreciative and modest, open. Dylan hardly looked up from his guitar as he smoked a cigarette. "You write for moms," he observed sarcastically. It wasn't merely a rejection. It was a shrug over a blade. Years of effort, suffering, and making room for emotional truth were all reduced to a stereotype in just one instant. Being authentic and writing about people's true emotions has been the foundation of Carole's profession. However, Dylan gave her the impression that her honesty was lacking, as if her voice wasn't appropriate for the adult rock and roll table. She was struck by the contrast. She wasn't gullible. She was aware of how masculine icons functioned, but she didn't anticipate it from Dylan, the master of metaphor, the prophet of rebellion. Or him. It was more than a personal sting. It had a philosophical bent. He didn't only make fun of her, he disparaged her idea of what music could be. She didn't mention it again. Something changed in her, not in songs or interviews. She ceased supporting him and quoting him, and she responded with courteous quiet when his name was mentioned. Some wounds hum beneath the surface because they don't scream. Furthermore, the deepest slashes were always quiet for Carole rather than loud, and they originated from the individuals she believed were paying attention. The incident with Joni Mitchell was the most painful. Two pioneers' initial respect swiftly turned into a quiet competition. They were the few women who were writing their truth and making a difference in a man's world by using melody rather than cacophony. Recognized Joni as a smart, poetic and fearless kindred spirit at first. She supported her from the sidelines, purchased all of her records, and defended her brilliance to those who didn't understand it. However, Joni fostered an image of remoteness, seclusion and intellectual superiority, whereas Carole leaned into warmth, community and a spirit of cooperation. The cut followed. Carole's name was mentioned one evening at a gathering of musicians and industry insiders, and Joni derided her writing as domestic poetry, a term that denigrated all Carole stood for, while wearing her icy, cruel smirk. Within days she received word not as a rumor, as a reality. Carole was devastated. More powerful than any negative review was just one sentence. She had always felt that the mundane and the sacredness of daily life were given voice by her job, but suddenly the very person she had previously looked up to diminished it to something insignificant and forgettable. She didn't go up to Joni. She wasn't like that. However, something changed. She ceased reciting Joni's lyrics, playing her music. Additionally, she avoided answering questions about herself in interviews by wearing a smile so tightly that it could break. Because that's what happens when someone you look up to hurts you. There is no bruise left behind. Silence is left behind. Even a piano cannot sustain the weight of the silence. None of them, however, could compare to the ruthless, premeditated brutality of the man who sought to own everything, even her. The last name she ever wanted to mention was Phil Spector. There is no need to introduce this name, but it was more than just celebrity for Carole King. It was accompanied with fear. In the Brill Building, where young composers pursued their ambitions and watched them perish in echo chambers surrounded by gold records and ego, Spector's shadow hung heavy over her formative years. She initially observed him from a distance, appreciated his work, and loved the soundscapes he produced. However, that awe gave way to fear. In private, she referred to the man behind the glitzy hits and the renowned wall of sound as a dictator wearing a velvet cloak. He had a chilly appeal. There was a warning attached to his compliments. Additionally, he used his power as a weapon. He mocked her piano-driven songs, disparaged her ideas in front of her peers, and once advised her to leave the heavy lifting to the males. Carole had just left adolescence. She said nothing. She bowed her head. However, there was a crack inside. He cornered her in the corridor outside Studio B one late, quiet and memorable night. Just him, tall and sneering, with no cameras or witnesses. Not even in her memoirs did she relate the things he murmured to her friends. However, she made a vow that night that she would never again work for him. As the years went by and her songs became more popular, she became more determined. She created a way without his consent, his noise or his threats. And Carole didn't bat an eyelid when Spector's violent, insane and criminal acts were revealed. It wasn't shocking to her. The beast had finally taken off its mask, and the reckoning had been long coming. One of the most sinister characters in music has now revealed to the world what she already knew. Without soul, such strength is only noise. This is about the truth, not resentment. Furthermore, reality has always existed for Carole King in the notes that lie between the lines, in the silences where sound is subdued by emotion. She allowed her piano to speak for decades. During interviews she maintained a smile, She avoided conflict. She opted for elegance rather than conflict. So far, because silence can sometimes isolate and harden rather than always heal. Additionally, the weight of what was left unsaid became intolerable for a lady whose job was based on sincerity. The songs were inspired by the scars and were never intended to conceal them. However, now that time has passed and her legacy is assured, she is removing the curtain. These 6 musicians were chapters in her narrative, not just names. Others provided wounds disguised as praises, while others sparked suppressed fury and disillusionment. Her spirit bears the imprints of their acts. They attempted to turn her voice into background music, disrupted her rhythm, and took over her harmony. This is release, not retaliation, an exhalation long overdue from the woman who provided the most intimate soundtrack in the world. And at last, Carole King, the kind soul behind your favorite song, is speaking loudly, expressing her emotions and challenging everyone to listen without turning away.